Hey everyone, Rant Kid here. I've been playing Warframe for a very long time, and for the entirety of that time, this game's community has had a habit that drives me insane. For some reason, it's always been popular to compare two different Warframes on the basis of some superficial characteristic without any nuance, and I don't get why people do it. So, in today's video, I'm gonna go through a bunch of examples of this phenomenon and talk about why I think it's stupid. I do want to mention that I'm not making any statement about a frame's viability or tier list placement or anything like that. I just want to illustrate how the frames I talk about are different. So, let's start with the oldest enduring comparison, Ash and Loki. These two have been the center of debate since the game's release, and it's all over them having one similar ability. The argument is basically this. Ash has Smokescreen, which makes him invisible, and Loki has Invisibility, which makes him invisible, so who's the better invisibility frame? This, of course, ignores literally every other ability they have to draw this surface level comparison. Ash and Loki don't even have the same role, they both just have an ability that turns them invisible for a duration. Looking at Ash, he is fundamentally a damage dealer. His passive grants him a boost to slash procs, increasing their damage and duration, which helps his weapons and abilities. Teleport, his third ability, can be used to initiate a finisher on one specific target for massive damage. Most notably, Blade Storm can be used to mark and clear crowds over the course of a couple business days. Compare that to Loki, who is very much a crowd control frame. Decoy is a great tool for manipulating enemy AI, keeping them in a certain area or keeping their fire off of a valuable target. Switch Teleport can be used to give Loki a speed boost while also displacing a single target, which can be nichely helpful for certain situations. Radial Disarm is another ability that manipulates enemy AI by forcing them into melee combat, which can be used in conjunction with Decoy to funnel enemies into certain areas. When their kits are laid out side by side, the comparison between the two invisibility sources becomes much less sensible. Comparing Ash and Loki purely on the basis of they can go invisible for a time is so reductive that it's ultimately meaningless, because Ash and Loki don't even have the same job. And that's not even considering augments. Loki can augment his invisibility to silence all of his weapons, including ones that can't normally be silenced, while Ash can give his invisibility a support role by granting it to allies and boosting critical chance. Yeah, they can both turn invisible, but they share basically no other similarities, so comparing the two on that metric alone is just unhelpful. Next up, I have another classic pair, Inaros and Nidus. These two are often compared on the basis that they both have big health bars and no shields, and I'll even concede that they're both crowd control oriented frames with passives that death catch. The thing is, even with these similarities, they both play very differently. Let's start with Inaros, who revolves around melee finishers. His first ability opens enemies to standing finishers, his second ability opens enemies to ground finishers, and any kind of finisher kill grants Inaros health. These abilities are both crowd control as well, and that is also a thing that Nidus does, but the focus on finishers is unique to Inaros and distinguishes his gameplay loop. Inaros' 3 is a pretty boring ability all things considered, but his 4 is another crowd control ability with some cool stuff tacked on. It inflicts corrosive on enemies, so it can be used to spread armor reduction, and it also spawns the Sand Kitties, which deal an impressive amount of damage. This lets Inaros play as a crowd control frame, a tank frame, and a summoner frame all at once, especially if Desiccation's Curse is being used. Now let's look at Nidus, who has one major difference right off the bat, mutation. Nidus' mutation meter is the single biggest difference between him and basically everyone else in the cast, making him very reliant on mission length to reach his power ceiling. His gameplay loop revolves around his first two abilities, group enemies up with larvae and then hit them with virulence. This serves the purpose of building mutation early on, but as you progress and build up your stacks, it eventually serves as a mechanism to actually kill enemies, especially in conjunction with a primer or Unairu's Caustic Strike. Nidus' third ability, Parasitic Link, is also really interesting, as it can be used as a damage reduction ability for Nidus, or as a way for Nidus to support a single ally with a damage and ability strength buff. Nidus' fourth ability, Ravenous, also leans into his support role by healing allies standing in it. Ravenous also spawns maggots, which are great for distracting and stunning enemies, while also dealing additional damage and granting additional mutation when hit with virulence. Nidus also has a notably different passive than Inaros, as while Inaros has to score melee hits to revive himself, Nidus avoids death entirely in exchange for 15 mutation stacks. The point I'm trying to make here is that, even if Inaros and Nidus have several similarities at a glance, the actual gameplay loop of each frame is very different. Inaros relies on finishers and cats, while Nidus uses his 1-2 combo to deal with enemies and fuel the remainder of his kit. Inaros can strip armor on a wide scale with his 4, while Nidus offers unique support benefits to his team with his 3. Sure, they both have CC abilities and a big health bar, but the moment-to-moment gameplay of each frame is very different. On to our next pair, we've got Excalibur and Baruuk. This one has been around since Baruuk's release, and while it kind of died off with the release of the Steel Path, the Exalted rework and Techrot Encore brought it back with a vengeance. The main comparison between the two is that they both have wave-shooting exalted melees, but what I often see people saying is that Excalibur is outright better than Baruuk because he doesn't require as much setup. This, again, ignores basically every other difference in their kits because of this one commonality, so let's go over each of them. As for Excalibur, he's a frame I'd describe as somewhat of a glass cannon, with a lot of damage in exchange for minimal survivability. His 1 is a solid damage ability with great mobility, letting him move through missions very fast. His 2, Radial Blind, acts as on-demand 360 crowd control and doubles as a melee damage buff, as enemies under the effects of Radial Blind take stealth damage while blinded. Excalibur's Radial Javelin can be used to clear groups of trash mobs, or when combined with the Furious Javelin augment, it can double as another melee damage buff. Moving on to Baruuk, he has 2 major differences from Excalibur out of the gate. He is very tanky, and he focuses much more on crowd control. This all revolves around Restraint, Baruuk's unique resource that fuels his Exalted, while also granting him up to 50% damage reduction based on how much is depleted. Elude, Baruuk's first ability, can be used to dodge all enemy attacks short of AoEs, which makes him hard to kill up front while also reducing Restraint. His 2, Lull, puts enemies to sleep in a huge radius while again reducing Restraint, making it a very good crowd control ability. Desolate Hands, Baruuk's third ability, disarms enemies near him while granting him up to 90% damage reduction, doubling as both a form of light CC and a huge source of DR. So, does Baruuk require more setup than Excalibur? Yes, he does, but the rest of his kit gives him very different tools. Baruuk is much harder to kill out of the box, but he doesn't have the same melee damage amplification in his toolkit. Removed from their Exalted, these frames are, again, very different, and can be built in very unique ways relative to one another. Excalibur can be used as a potent weapons platform for pretty much any melee, and Baruuk can be played like a tank or crowd control frame with much greater ease than Excalibur. This next comparison is kind of outdated, but I wanted to give a quick nod to Oberon and Wisp. Because they both provide the team with healing over time, pre-rework Oberon was often considered a direct downgrade from Wisp. While I do think that Wisp was a better frame overall at the time, Oberon still had tools in his kit that Wisp didn't, like team-wide status immunity and radial armor removal. Now that Oberon has been reworked, this comparison doesn't get brought up nearly as often, but I thought it deserved a nod because it persisted for years up to the rework's release. Instead of talking about a single pair, Cyte-09 finds himself caught up in 2, one with Ivara and another with Lavos. Let's start with his comparison with Ivara because it's much more direct. Much like Loki and Ash, these two are often compared because they both have invisibility, though this time they both also have exalted weapons. This comparison certainly holds more merit than Ash and Loki, but the way it's framed is similar to Excalibur and Baruuk. I've seen many people say that Cyte is a direct upgrade to Ivara, and there's no reason to play her anymore. Now, I do think that Ivara could use some love, and Cyte is an incredibly powerful frame, but I don't think it's fair to discount the unique elements Ivara has. Her first ability gives her both support and crowd control, especially when used with the Empowered Quiver augment. Navigator is one of the most interesting abilities in the whole game, and it's the center of a lot of wacky and fun playstyles all by itself. Prowl also has some interesting minutiae to it compared to Evade, primarily involving the pickpocket mechanic, which can let you do weird stuff like charge an Eidolon lure off of one Vombalist. Artemis Bow is also a very different Exalted compared to Neutralizer, with or without Concentrated Arrow. They both do emphasize headshots, but Ivara can either fire a huge line of arrows to kill groups of enemies, or fire a single explosive arrow to clear rooms on headshot. I do think that, again, this comparison makes more sense than most of the others we've covered. Both have Exalteds that like headshots, both can turn invisible, and both have an on-demand source of small-scale hard CC. But to say Ivara is a direct downgrade to Cyte denies a lot of what makes Ivara special, especially when it comes to Navigator. Does this make Ivara top tier? No, it doesn't. But does Cyte's existence make Ivara useless? Also no. She still has plenty of fun stuff that's unique to her. Now let's move on to Lavos, who is normally compared to Cyte because of one thing they share: elemental damage boosting. Cyte can do this using his second ability, Resupply, while Lavos can do it via his passive augment, Valence Formation. I'm gonna be honest, this comparison low-key pisses me off, because it usually lacks any of the crucial details. I've seen many people say Cyte is a direct upgrade to Lavos because of this, and that's just so wrong for so many reasons. So, let's look at each ability, starting with Resupply. This ability grants Cyte elemental ammo for his currently equipped weapon, while also deploying 2 ammo packs of the same element for his teammates to collect. The ability immediately refills Cyte's magazine on cast, and collecting the ammo box also refills the current magazine. While elemental ammo is in play, the weapon will deal an extra instance of damage that guarantees a proc of its respective element. The damage of this extra hit is 25% of the weapon's total damage, scaling with strength, and the bonus is doubled to 50% for sniper rifles. Now let's take a look at Valence Formation, which also grants Lavos a boost in elemental damage. The element selected for the boost is based on the element Lavos had infused for his last ability cast, and it applies to all of Lavos' weapons at the same time. Unlike Cyte-09, this damage boost is not a separate instance of damage, but it does still guarantee a proc of its respective element. You can think of it like a non-combining elemental mod on top of each hit inflicting the infused element. This bonus sits at 200% and does not scale with strength. The buff also lasts for 25 seconds at base, which does scale with duration. So these abilities do sound similar on the surface, but they have some huge differences. For one, Cyte-09 refills his ammo on each cast, whereas Lavos would have to use Transmutation Probe on ammo boxes for that. Cyte can also share his ammo boxes with his teammates, while Lavos can't share his buff with allies. Looking at Lavos' buff, it most notably applies to all of his weapons, which lets him do many things Cyte can't. This is most notable when it comes to melees, as Lavos can do things like trigger influence without modding for electric, or spread the infused element using influence. Cyte's elemental ammo also doesn't work on Incarnans or battery weapons, but Lavos' buff does. Valence Formation's buff is also considered by DOTs inflicted by Lavos' abilities like Catalyze, which is a huge thing to note. This isn't even considering the fact that Lavos' boost is treated like an elemental mod, while Cyte's is considered its own damage instance, which adds a lot of nuance. Cyte's extra instance of damage lets him do some weird stuff, like trigger resupply's elemental proc with the explosion from acid shells. As for Lavos, his ability being treated like an elemental mod makes the DOTs it inflicts incredibly strong out of the box. This one difference is honestly so complex I could make an entire video out of it alone, but the point I'm trying to make is this. If you want to play Cyte or Lavos purely for the elemental damage bonus, there's still a lot of meaningful difference between the two. Even beyond that, let's not forget that Cyte-09 and Lavos have very different kits and gameplay loops. Even if you're going for just the elemental buff, there's still so much variance between the two that has to be taken into account when picking your frame. Like I said earlier, this comparison is normally so lacking on details that it actually kinda makes me mad, but maybe that's just because I'm Lavos' strongest soldier. This next pair is the most recent comparison I've seen, Ember and Temple, on account of them both using heat damage in their abilities. This, like every comparison in this video, lacks any nuance, so let's break things down. First up, what's similar? Well, Ember and Temple can both grant allies a heat damage bonus via Fireball Frenzy and Ripper's Wail respectively. Pyrotechnics and Inferno are also kind of similar, being abilities that spawn a lot of fire, but that's kinda where it ends. Temple has Overdrive to boost critical damage, the Backbeat mechanic that rewards timing their ability casts, and an entire Exalted Flamethrower in Lizzie. On the other side of the coin, Ember has Immolation, which grants her up to 90% damage reduction and a boost to her abilities, but in exchange it will destroy her energy economy if left unchecked. She also has a Radial Armor Strip and Fire Blast that even grants Overguard if used with Healing Flame. Inferno is also a very unique ability, scaling pretty well if enemies are grouped up, and even granting Energy Orbs when used with Exothermic. Like always, these two frames play very differently, even if they both have a fire theme. Temple's gameplay loop often revolves around applying the Overdrive debuff, abusing the invincibility from Ripper's Wail, and using Lizzie to fry groups of enemies, all while timing their casts to Backbeat. In contrast, Ember focuses much more on managing her Immolation meter to maximize both her damage reduction and the effectiveness of her other abilities. The playstyle between the two is quite different, and even if they both light enemies on fire and grant heat damage to allies, they're still distinct. I'll admit that there's a lot of depth to both frames I could explore for this comparison, but I don't see people making it as often as the others, so I'm kinda speedrunning this one. I actually have two pairs of comparisons to talk about next, those being Volt and Gyre, as well as Vauban and Protea. Why am I bringing these up? Well, it's because I've seen people say that, because these frames share similar themes, Gyre and Protea should have been full-on reworks for Volt and Vauban instead of their own frames. This one has so many problems. I don't feel like I need to go super in-depth to explain the issues here, so let's just give a high-level overview of each situation. Volt is a frame who uses electricity damage and has crowd control elements, and Gyre does the same, but the tools they have are very different across each frame. Volt has a strong support buff in speed, a damage amp and defensive tool in Electric Shield, and radial crowd control with Discharge that doubles as an incredibly strong survivability tool via Capacitance. Gyre has area control with Arc Sphere, grouping with Coil Horizon, crit and energy boosting from Cathode Grace, and area damage and crowd control with Rotor Swell. Even if both frames are superficially similar, they play totally differently, with Volt being more of a jack-of-all-trades, while Gyre focuses much more on area control and arcing damage. Next up is Vauban and Protea, which is honestly an even worse comparison because they play completely differently. Vauban is, at his core, a crowd control frame. Sure, he has the same tactician theme as Protea, but it's used in a totally different way. Vauban's playstyle normally revolves around manipulating enemies to set up for his damage abilities. He can use Bastille to remove armor so Flechette Orb hits harder, he can use Vortex to group up enemies for Photon Strike, his kit revolves around this game of setup and payoff. Vauban uses his crowd control to bolster his damage. It's a pretty classic formula for a Warframe. Protea is much more of a jack of all trades, with area control and shield regen from her 1, damage on her 2, utility from her 3, and a 4 that lets her spam all of these things before exploding in a huge nuke of damage. While Vauban's idea is more about setting up for his damage abilities, Protea is more about being prepared for any situation. She can spam turrets for damage, spam shrapnel to lock down enemies, spam shield satellites to stay in her shield gate, and keep her dispensary up to fuel herself and her allies. Protea also has a support slant from both shield satellites and dispensary, while Vauban's only comparable ability is the damage buff from Overdriver. The gameplay and execution of both of these frames is so different that I can only imagine people comparing them because of their similar theme alone, and I find that kind of absurd. Like with Gyre and Volt, it seems like some members of the Warframe community don't want DE to explore an existing theme from a new angle. As a result, these flimsy comparisons are drawn and then blown out of proportion to make it seem like DE is either lacking originality or turning reworks into new Warframes. I will concede that Volt and Gyre do have a few things in common, even if they ultimately play quite differently. But Vauban and Protea? Those two are so different in practice that it leaves me scratching my head. Real quick, I want to give an honorable mention to a pair that used to be compared a lot, Hydroid and Yareli. Because of their water theming, many people said prior to her release that Yareli should have just been a rework for Hydroid. Fortunately, after Yareli's release, it seems like the community at large has realized how ridiculous of an idea that is. This was no doubt partially because Yareli wasn't great on release, but the differences between her and Hydroid are just too obvious and overwhelming. They are both frames with a water theme and strong crowd control tools, but Yareli is more about doing 6 skateboard tricks and grouping enemies up for big damage, while Hydroid is about stealing enemy armor and boosting his own corrosive damage. He also, shakes enemies around until they drop more loot, which is the main reason people play him these days. Like I said, this comparison isn't really relevant anymore, but I wanted to give it some acknowledgement like I did with Oberon and Wisp. So, now that we're through all my bitching, you're probably wondering, cool kid, what was the point of this video? Well, to be honest, there isn't one. I just wanted to rant about this topic because it annoys me so much. But because we're here, I want this to be the takeaway. Every Warframe in this game has something unique to offer, and boiling them down to one-note comparisons is reductive and misleading. Oftentimes these comparisons are drawn with the goal of finding a winner of sorts, and I think that's the worst part. Each and every frame in this game offers something unique, even if they share similarities with other frames, because no frame has the same toolkit as any other frame. Even beyond that, who cares if one frame is better than another that's similar? If you like a particular frame and they get the job done, then don't let anybody tell you that you can't play who you enjoy. I also want to clarify that, despite the video title, there are times where comparing Warframes makes sense. Take, for example, the Acid Shells build on Sobek, which works well with Cyte, Saren, and Araxia. Weighing the pros and cons of each frame within the context of that build makes sense, but you have to look at the whole picture. Saying that, for example, Araxia is the best for the setup because she has the highest damage buff ignores everything else that the other two frames have to offer. It also makes sense to compare frames if you need them for a particular job, like picking between Necros, Korra, and Hydroid for a farming run, or Frost, Gara, and Limbo for a defense mission. But here's the thing. It makes sense to compare frames if they're accomplishing a similar task, but the comparison between them shouldn't wholly hinge on one similarity. If you find yourself in a situation where it's sensible to compare options, do your best to keep the whole picture in mind. Warframe is an incredibly complex game, and boiling things down to their most bare similarities is often unhelpful. Alright, that's enough moralizing. Thank you very much if you survived this unhinged rant of mine. I know it's very different from what I normally do, but if I'm perfectly honest, I got told to play Excalibur over Baruuk one too many times, and I snapped. If you enjoyed the video, I'd appreciate it if you left a like, and if you want to see more garbage from this channel, then subscribe for more sludge. Please do let me know your thoughts on this topic in the comments, though as always, I do ask that you be civil. I also want to give a massive thank you to all of my channel members, as they're somehow willing to pay me for this stuff. Thank you again for watching, and let me know if you want to see more stuff like this. That's all for today's video, so tune in next time when people inevitably compare Uriel to Ember, which will cause me to have a stroke.